At 7:18 p.m. on Veterans Day, my only son stood at the microphone in the San Antonio Veterans Hall and told 200 people I was wearing medals I had not earned. He did not sound angry. Mark sounded careful, sorrowful, and rehearsed the way a man sounds when he wants cruelty to pass for concern. The mayor was seated at the front table. The county judge was beside him. The president of the Veterans Council sat under a row of American flags with his hands folded over the printed program, and my granddaughter Grace sat near the stage in a navy blue dress, watching her father decide which version of me she was allowed to inherit. Mark held up my old Air Force service jacket by the collar. "My mother has been confused since my father's death," he said. "Tonight, for the dignity of real veterans, I think we need to be honest. Those medals belong to my dad. She was a nurse near a base, not some combat officer. This is not the kind of story our scholarship should honor." Forks stopped moving. A coffee cup touched a saucer too hard. Somewhere behind me, an old chair creaked. Nobody laughed. That would have been easier to forgive. Instead, grown men looked down at their plates, while women who had known me for 30 years suddenly found the tablecloth interesting. My place card had been moved to the back, beside the kitchen doors. Mark had the microphone, the stage, the printed program, and the family table. I had a cane beside my chair, gray hair pinned at the back of my neck, and a blue service binder under my left hand. Inside that binder was a certified copy of my DD, 214, retirement orders, an Air Medal citation with an embossed seal, and a photograph from a desert airfield that Mark had never bothered to ask about. 2 tables behind him sat retired Master Sergeant Daniel Price, the wounded soldier my son had just called part of my confusion. I did not stand up, not yet. I was not silent because I had no answer. I was silent because accusation has to finish speaking before evidence can answer. Before dessert was served, the same room that avoided my eyes would have to hear my rank corrected into the microphone. Before the night ended, my son would learn that the jacket he raised as proof of my confusion carried a silver oak leaf on the shoulder, not my husband's stripes. To understand why Mark believed he could erase me in a room built for honor, you have to understand how slowly a family can edit a woman out of her own history. I was 68 years old when that banquet happened, but my son had been practicing disbelief for years. My name is Eleanor Whitaker, though most people have called me Ellie since before my hands learned to fold hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. I was born in Waco, raised in a Baptist house with screen doors that slapped shut and a father who believed your word should be cleaner than your shoes. I joined the Air Force Nurse Corps in 1980, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I wanted a life larger than the county line. And because my mother had once said mercy was strongest when it knew how to stand up straight. I served 26 years. I retired as a lieutenant colonel. I wore the silver oak leaf. I worked aeromedical evacuation, critical care, training flights, and deployments where the line between rear area and danger was not as neat as civilians like to imagine. I was not infantry. I never pretended to be. I did not kick doors or carry a rifle on patrol. My job was to keep men and women alive long enough to get them home. And some nights, that job required every nerve God had given me. My husband Samuel understood that. He was Army, retired as a master sergeant, a man with broad shoulders and a laugh that filled the kitchen. When people asked who had the harder service, he would grin and say, "I fixed engines. Ellie fixed people. Guess which one yells louder when it breaks?" He never once made me smaller so he could stand taller. We raised one son, Mark, in a house with 2 uniforms in the hallway closet and a flag folded in a cedar box from Samuel's father. Mark grew up around base housing, church potlucks, transfer orders, cheap lawn chairs at Little League games, and the sound of my pager going off during dinner. I missed some school plays. Samuel missed some birthdays. We both carried guilt in different pockets. When Mark was little, he loved my flight jacket. He would drag it down the hallway, the sleeves trailing behind him, and say he was going to fly the sick people home. I still have a picture of him at 4 years old, wearing that jacket backward, his face nearly hidden by the collar. In those days, he was proud of both of us, because children do not know yet which pride adults will reward. By the time Mark reached high school, the story in our house had started to tilt. Samuel's service was easier for neighbors to understand. He had dusty photographs, unit patches, a purple heart from a shrapnel wound he called a metal splinter, and a way of talking that made men slap his back at barbecues. My service lived in binders, medical records, flight logs, and the faces of people who had left my care on stretchers and written me letters years later. When a boy at school asked Mark if his mother had been just a nurse, Mark came home angry and embarrassed. I remember that afternoon clearly. He was 16, slamming the refrigerator door, Too old to cry and too young to hide that he wanted to. Why don't you ever tell people what you really did? He snapped. I was standing at the sink washing lettuce for dinner. I do tell people, honey. I was an Air Force nurse. No, I mean the big stuff. That has stories. You just say nursing. I turned off the faucet. Nursing is the big stuff. He rolled his eyes in the theatrical way teenagers do when they are trying to injure the parent who knows them best. Nobody thinks that I should have sat him down that day. I should have explained rank, medical evacuation, field hospitals, flight crews, triage, and the strange shame some people feel when a woman's service does not match the picture in their head. Instead, I dried my hands and told him he was hungry and tired. That was one of my flaws. I mistook endurance for instruction. I believed silence was dignity, when sometimes silence is just a blank space someone else can fill with lies. Samuel tried to correct it in his way. When Mark made a joke about me bossing people around because I had played colonel at the hospital, Samuel put down his fork. Your mother did not play anything, he said. Men with more rank than you can imagine listened when she spoke. Mark muttered an apology, but I could see resentment behind his eyes. It was not hatred. It was something sadder. He wanted a simple father-hero story, one he could carry easily. He did not want the complicated truth that his mother had held authority, made decisions under pressure, and carried wounds nobody saluted. After Samuel died, that tilt became a slope. Samuel passed on a Wednesday morning in late October, 3 years before the banquet. He had been living with congestive heart failure for nearly a year, though he hated the word battling because, as he said, I'm not fighting my own heart, Ellie. I'm negotiating with a stubborn employee. He died at home in our bedroom with the curtains open and my hand on his chest. The house went quiet in a way I had never known. Military wives know many kinds of quiet. Deployment quiet, night shift quiet, the quiet after children leave home. But widow quiet is different. It sits in the extra coffee cup, in the left side of the bed, in the chair where Boots used to be. Mark came over the next day with his wife, Denise. Denise had married into our family 8 years earlier, polished and pleasant. The kind of woman who always remembered birthdays but rarely remembered pain unless it could be photographed. She worked in marketing for a medical supply company and had a talent for turning every family event into something suitable for a newsletter. I do not say that to be cruel. Denise had gifts. She could organize a fundraiser in 48 hours, charm donors, choose flowers, and make people feel they were part of something important. She also believed image was a form of truth. At Samuel's funeral, Mark gave a beautiful eulogy. He spoke of his father's discipline, humor, sacrifice, and service. He cried once, and I reached for his hand. He let me hold it for 3 seconds before pulling away to straighten his tie. When it was my turn, I spoke only briefly. I said Samuel had been my best friend, my shelter, and the only man I knew who could burn toast and still call it breakfast, with confidence. People smiled through tears. I mentioned his service. I mentioned our marriage. I did not mention mine. Afterward, in the church hall, Grace came to me carrying a paper plate with a piece of sheet cake sliding toward the edge. She was 7 then, all elbows and questions. Grandma, she whispered. Were you in the army too? Air Force, I said. Her eyes brightened. Did you know Grandpa there? I knew him because of service, yes. Before she could ask more, Denise appeared behind her and placed both hands on Grace's shoulders. Grandma helped sick people near the military, she said brightly. Grandpa was the soldier. It was such a small sentence, soft, almost harmless, the kind of sentence that disappears in a room full of casseroles. But I felt it land. I looked at Denise. She smiled as if she had simplified something for a child. I said nothing. That was how it began after Samuel's death. Not with a shout, with edits. At the bank, Mark offered to help with paperwork because he said, Mom, you're tired. Dad handled the bigger stuff. Samuel had never handled the bigger stuff alone. We had paid bills together for 42 years. I knew the mortgage balance, the insurance deductible, the combination to the fireproof safe, and which drawer held the warranty for the water heater. But grief had made me slower, and Mark mistook slowness for incapacity. At church, Denise told women I was having a hard time tracking details. The details she meant were dates she had changed twice and invitations she had sent to the wrong email address. When I arrived late to Grace's school concert, because Denise had texted the start time as 7 instead of 6:30, I found Mark standing in the hallway with his arms crossed. Mom, this is what we're talking about, he said. What are we talking about? He lowered his voice. You forgetting things. I held up my phone with Denise's message. He glanced at it, then looked away. Still, he said, you need to be more careful. Still, That word has covered many sins in family life. Then came the scholarship. A month after Samuel's funeral, Denise suggested creating a small community scholarship in his honor. The idea itself was lovely. Samuel had mentored young mechanics and always believed trade school deserved as much respect as college. He used to say the country would fall apart faster from a shortage of good welders than from a shortage of philosophers. Denise wanted to call it the Samuel Whitaker Veterans Legacy Scholarship. She designed a logo with his army photo on it. Mark asked me for permission to use part of the memorial fund. I said yes. I also suggested that the scholarship include military spouses, medics, nurses, and caregivers, because Samuel had always respected the whole circle of service. Denise's smile tightened. That's a little broad, don't you think? Donors respond to clarity. Samuel's story is clear. Mark nodded. Dad's service is what people connect with. We can always mention you in the family section. The family section. I remember looking at the draft brochure and seeing my name under survived by, as if I were part of Samuel's obituary rather than the woman who had stood beside him for a lifetime. I almost corrected it. Then I thought, it is his scholarship. Let him have the light. That thought came from love. It also came from habit. The first year, the scholarship banquet was modest. 60 people in the church fellowship hall. Mark spoke. Denise arranged the slideshow. Grace handed the recipient a certificate. I sat at the family table between Grace and Samuel's empty chair. There was a small card on that chair with his name printed in blue ink. Denise said it was symbolic. I thought it was tender. Near the end of the evening, Mark introduced me as my mother, who supported my dad through everything. People applauded. I stood and smiled. Supporting Samuel was honorable, but something in me wanted him to add one more sentence. My mother also served. He did not. The second year, the banquet moved to the Veterans Hall downtown. More donors came. The local paper sent a reporter. The scholarship grew from 1 recipient to 3. Denise had banners printed, and Mark became comfortable on a stage. My chair was no longer beside Samuel's empty chair. I was placed with church friends, which Denise called better for conversation. Samuel's symbolic chair remained at the front. That night, a retired Marine named Joe Alvarez came up to me near the coffee urn. Joe lived 3 houses down from me and knew enough about my past to be dangerous to anyone trying to simplify it. Ellie, he said, nodding toward the stage. Why aren't you up there? It's Samuel's night. Joe looked at me over the rim of his paper cup. Honor doesn't get smaller when you share it. I smiled because I did not want to cry in public. You always did talk like a bumper sticker. Only when people need to read one. Joe was the first person who made me feel the danger of what I was allowing. But I still believed Mark knew the truth underneath the ceremony. I believed he was grieving. I believed time would soften him. Time can soften people. It can also give them room to harden around a lie. The year after Samuel died, I had a small health scare. It was not a stroke, though Mark began calling it that whenever it suited him. It was a transient ischemic attack, a warning sign that sent me to the hospital for 2 nights and home with medication, instructions, and more caution than I wanted. My speech slurred for less than an hour. My right hand felt heavy. By the next morning, I was answering the neurologist's questions with more precision than he expected. Mark came to the hospital with Denise and a folder. We need to talk about powers of attorney, he said, before asking whether I was frightened. I was sitting in bed with an IV taped to my hand. The room smelled like antiseptic and coffee that had given up trying. Grace had drawn a picture on the whiteboard of a woman with wings. She had labeled it Grandma Airplane Nurse. I already have documents, I said. Joe is my backup for medical decisions, and my attorney has copies. Mark's face changed. Joe Alvarez? The neighbor? A trusted friend? I'm your son. Yes. And right now, you are leading with paperwork. Denise stepped closer to the bed. Ellie, nobody's trying to take anything. We just want to protect your dignity. There it was again. Dignity used like a blanket thrown over a locked door. My dignity is not in danger from my signature, I said. It is in danger from people discussing it before they discuss me. Mark looked wounded, which worked on me then. Mothers are vulnerable to the wounded faces of children, even when the child is 41 and wearing a watch more expensive than her first car. Mom, Dad would want me to look after you. Your father would want you to listen to me? The conversation ended badly. Not loud. Badly does not always mean loud. Sometimes badly means everyone leaves with the truth still sitting on the bed between them. After that, Mark became watchful. He noticed if I repeated a story. He corrected me when I paused for a name. He asked if I had taken my pills in the same tone he used with Grace when she forgot her lunchbox. At family dinners, Denise would say, We don't want grandma getting overwhelmed whenever I try to talk about finances or the scholarship. One Sunday after church, I overheard Denise talking to the pastor's wife near the coat rack. The grief changed her, Denise said. And after that mini stroke, Mark has had to manage so much. She gets attached to old military things and mixes up what was hers and what was Sam's. I stood behind a wooden partition with my coat over my arm and listened to two women lower their voices around my life. The pastor's wife said, "That must be hard." Denise sighed. "It is. We just don't want her embarrassing herself." Embarrassing herself. I looked down at my hands. They were older, yes. The knuckles ached in cold weather. A thin scar crossed my left thumb from a field kit that snapped shut during a sandstorm in 1991. Those hands had started IV lines in turbulence, held pressure on wounds, signed performance reports, buttoned Mark's pajamas, buried my husband, and baked Grace's birthday cakes. They did not shake from confusion that day. They shook from restraint. I went home and opened the hallway closet. My service jacket hung behind Samuel's dress uniform in a garment bag. My name tape was still there. Whitaker. The silver oak leaf insignia sat where it belonged. My ribbons were aligned under plastic. In a blue binder on the shelf were my records, protected in sleeves because military paperwork has a way of becoming important long after people stop asking for it. I took the binder to the kitchen table and opened it. The tabs were still neat. Commissioning, training, evaluations, deployment orders, awards, retirement, letters. Under letters was one from Daniel Price. I had not read it in years. "Ma'am," it began, "my daughter graduates kindergarten next week. She exists because you kept me breathing between Dahran and Ramstein. I know you will say you were only doing your job. I hope someday you understand that for my family, your job became our whole world." I folded the letter back along its old creases. I should have called Mark that night. I should have said, "Sit down, son. We need to talk about what you are telling people." But there is a kind of exhaustion that comes after years of being misunderstood by someone you raised. It is not weakness. It is grief without a funeral. So I put the binder back in the closet. That was my mistake. The trouble moved from whispers to paper the following spring. Denise came by with a draft for the third annual scholarship banquet. She arrived with her laptop, a cinnamon candle she said would warm up the space, and a folder of printed materials. Mark was at work. Grace was at school. I made coffee and set out banana bread, because manners are sometimes the last fence between affection and war. The draft program had Samuel's photograph on the cover. Below it were the words, "A legacy of real sacrifice." I read that phrase twice. Inside, the family history page said Samuel Whitaker served his nation with courage while his wife Eleanor supported the home front through years of military life. The home front. I placed the program on the table. "Denise, this needs correcting." She looked up from her laptop. "Is there a typo? A factual error. I did not support only from the home front. I served 26 years in the Air Force." Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Of course. But for branding purposes, the focus is Samuel. Branding does not get to change facts." She smiled carefully. "Ellie, no one is erasing you." Then put the truth in the program. The smile thinned. "The truth is complicated." That sentence told me more than she meant to say. I closed the folder. Complicated is not the opposite of true. Denise leaned back. "Mark said you might react this way." "What way?" "Defensive." I felt something in my chest go still. "A correction is not a defense." She lowered her voice. "Ellie, please understand. We have donors now. The foundation is becoming something meaningful. People are inspired by Samuel's story. If we start adding claims that are hard to explain, it could distract from the mission." "Claims?" She looked away. "Say what you mean, Denise." She took a breath, the sort people take before saying something they have already rehearsed. "Mark found some of your things last month when he was checking the garage after the water leak. Medals, old papers, a jacket. He was worried because some of it seemed like Samuel's. He doesn't want anyone to think you're presenting his accomplishments as your own." For a moment, the kitchen clock sounded very loud. Mark went through my garage. He was helping. He went through my records. He was concerned. Concern has become one of the most dangerous words in the English language when used by people who want control without admitting it. I stood slowly. "Those are my records. My jacket. My awards." Denise's face softened with pity, and that pity burned worse than anger. "Ellie," she said, "we know what grief can do." I walked to the hallway closet and took down the blue binder. When I returned, Denise had closed her laptop halfway, as if protecting it from facts. I opened the binder to my retirement orders and turned it toward her. "Read this." She glanced down, but did not touch the page. "I don't know military paperwork." Then learn before you accuse. Her cheeks flushed. I didn't accuse you. No. You only brought the rope and asked me to admire the knot. She packed her laptop quickly after that. At the door. She turned back. Mark is going to be upset. Then Mark can come upset in person. He did. That evening, rain had started just before dusk, tapping the porch rail and darkening the street. Mark arrived without calling, which had become another way of telling me he no longer saw my house as entirely mine. He stood in the foyer shaking water from his jacket while I remained near the kitchen doorway. Did you tell Denise I was accusing you of something? He asked. Did you go through my military records in the garage? I checked boxes after the leak. Boxes labeled Air Force service records? He looked toward the hallway closet. Mom, you have to admit it's confusing. That stuff, your stuff, all mixed together. They're separated by name, branch, and garment bag. To you? Maybe. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because absurdity sometimes knocks on the door wearing a serious face. Mark, your father was Army enlisted. I was Air Force commissioned. His chevrons and my oak leaf are not easy to confuse. He rubbed his forehead. Most people don't know that. You should. That landed. I saw it in his jaw. I know enough, he said. I know Dad was the real military person in this family. The house seemed to draw in around us. The refrigerator hummed. Rain ran from his sleeves onto my floor. Say that again, I whispered. He swallowed. You know what I mean. He deployed. He sacrificed. He came back different. You were a nurse. Important? Sure, but not the same. I thought of a C-141 aircraft vibrating under my boots. I thought of blood freezing in tubing because the cabin temperature fought us. I thought of Daniel Price's hand gripping mine so hard my knuckles bruised. I thought of writing a letter to a mother because her son could not speak yet, and because I had promised him I would. No, I said, not the same. But real. Mark's eyes filled with a strange mix of anger and shame. Why are you doing this now? Doing what? Trying to compete with Dad. That was the lie beneath all the smaller lies. Not confusion, not paperwork, competition. I loved your father, I said. I do not have to become invisible to prove it. Mark looked away first. When he left, he did not slam the door. He closed it softly, which somehow hurt more. A slammed door announces anger. A soft door can pretend righteousness. The next morning, Grace called me from Denise's phone. Grandma, did you really fly hurt soldiers? I sat down at the kitchen table. Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes, Dad said, you get mixed up about old things. There are moments in a grandmother's life when anger must kneel behind love. Grace was 10. She was not responsible for the poison adults poured into her cup. Sometimes grown-ups remember things differently, I said carefully. But my service records remember with me. Can records remember in their own way? She was quiet. Then she asked, can I see them someday? My throat tightened. Yes. Someday, after we hung up, I sat at that table for a long time. Samuel's chair stood across from me, empty, one of his old flannel shirts folded over the back because I still had not found the courage to give it away. I wanted his voice in that room. I wanted him to walk through the door, call Mark by his full name, and straighten the story with one sentence. But the dead cannot do the work the living keep postponing. That afternoon, I called Colonel Teresa Bell. She had been my commanding officer during my last deployment and my friend for 20 years. Teresa was 72, sharp as a new needle, with white hair cut close to her head and a voice that could make a room sit up straighter without her raising it. She lived in Austin, volunteered with a veterans legal clinic, and had once told a 3-star general, "Sir, your rank does not make your assumption accurate," which remained one of my favorite sentences ever spoken in uniform. When she answered, I tried to make my voice ordinary. "Teresa, I need advice." She heard what I did not say. "Are you hurt?" "Not physically." "Then start at the beginning and don't protect anybody who is hurting you." So I told her everything. The program, the home, frontline, Denise, Mark, the stolen medals, insinuation, Grace's question. Teresa was silent for several seconds after I finished. Then she said, "Ellie, grief may explain your son's behavior. It does not grant him editing authority over your life." I closed my eyes. I don't want a public fight. Then prepare private facts. Public lies love unprepared people. That was the line that moved me from pain to strategy. Teresa told me to gather certified copies, not just old paperwork. She gave me the number for the County Veterans Service Office and the name of an attorney who understood elder financial abuse and reputation harm. She told me to write down every incident with dates, not because I needed to become bitter, but because memory deserved backup when others were calling it unreliable. And Ellie, she added, stop handing them your silence and hoping they will use it kindly. The next week became a campaign, though no one would have recognized it from the outside. I still watered my geraniums, went to church, took my blood pressure medicine, and drove Grace to piano on Wednesday. But in the mornings, I sat with the blue binder and rebuilt the public record of my own life. At the Veteran Service Office, a young man named Calvin helped me request certified copies. He was polite at first, in that brisk way people are when they think an older woman has lost a document and needs patient handling. Then he opened my file. His posture changed. Ma'am, he said, you retired as Ofive? Lieutenant-colonel, yes. He looked at the screen again. Air Medal, Aerial Achievement, Meritorious Service, Southwest Asia Service Medal, Humanitarian Service. This is... Yes, ma'am. We can get certified copies. I smiled. Thank you, Calvin. He printed forms and walked me through them without condescension after that. Before I left, he stood and shook my hand. My grandmother was a Navy corpsman, he said. People used to say she wasn't really military either. She hated it. I imagine she did. She would have liked you. That small kindness carried me all the way to the parking lot. The attorney's name was Rachel Kim. She had gray streaks at her temples, reading glasses on a chain, and a manner so calm it made Panic feel embarrassed. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. I brought my binder, the draft program, screenshots of messages, and a notebook where I had begun recording incidents. Rachel listened without interrupting. When I finished, she tapped her pen once. Your son has suggested diminished capacity to others? Yes. Has he tried to obtain financial authority? He brought papers to the hospital. I refused. Has he accessed your records or property without permission? The garage, possibly the hallway closet. I have changed the locks since then. She nodded. Good. Keep them changed. I felt embarrassed. I don't want to sue my son. You came here to understand your options, not to declare war. He is still my child. Rachel's expression softened. And you are still a person under the law. Those facts can coexist. She helped me update my estate documents, strengthen my medical directives, and send a formal letter to Mark and Denise stating that they had no authority over my records, property, military memorabilia, finances, or public representation. The letter was firm, not cruel. It asked that all scholarship materials be corrected to reflect accurate family history and that no statements be made implying cognitive impairment or misuse of military decorations. Mark called within 20 minutes of receiving it. You got a lawyer? He said. I got clarity. Against your own son? For myself. He laughed once, bitterly. Denise said you were going to make this ugly. Truth is only ugly to people who benefit from the wrong version. He hung up. For 3 days, I heard nothing. Then Pastor Clayton Mercer asked to meet me after Sunday service. Pastor Mercer was a good man in many ways, but good men can still prefer peace over truth when truth threatens committee work. He had known Samuel for years, had blessed the first scholarship dinner, and served unofficially as a moral stamp on Mark and Denise's foundation. We sat in his office under a framed print of a shepherd carrying a lamb. He folded his hands and looked at me with practiced concern. Ellie, Mark is worried. I know. He tells people that often. Pastor Mercer sighed. He feels the scholarship is becoming a point of pride and conflict. Samuel wouldn't want that. I looked at him until he shifted in his chair. Pastor, did Mark tell you I was claiming Samuel's medals? His eyes flickered. He said there has been some confusion. Did he tell you I retired as a lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force? He mentioned you served in a medical capacity. That was not my question. The room went quiet. I opened my purse and removed a copy of my retirement orders. I placed it on his desk, turned toward him. He did not reach for it immediately. You don't have to take sides, he said. Facts are not sides. He read the first page. His face changed slowly, like a window shade being raised in a room someone had kept dim. Ellie, he said, I didn't realize. That is why I am here. Realizing after damage has begun is not the same as preventing it. He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. What do you want me to do? Stop repeating concern that you have not verified. And if my name is discussed in any church or scholarship setting, tell the truth. He nodded. You're right. It was an apology, but not yet a repair. I had lived long enough to know the difference. The next escalation came through paper, again. A week before the banquet, Grace left her backpack at my house after piano practice. When I opened the front pocket to check for homework, a folded program proof slipped out. I had not been meant to see it. The final page listed the foundation board. Mark was president. Denise was communications director. Pastor Mercer was honorary chair. Samuel's empty chair was still noted in the ceremony. My name was gone entirely. Gone from the family statement. Gone from the scholarship history. Gone from the donor letter. At the bottom was a new paragraph. In keeping with Samuel Whitaker's legacy of authentic service, the foundation remains committed to honoring verified sacrifice and protecting the integrity of veterans' recognition. Verified sacrifice. Protecting integrity. I knew then that the banquet would not merely omit me, it would correct me publicly. I sat at the kitchen table with that program proof in front of me and the evening light turning gold across Samuel's empty chair. My first feeling was not anger, it was nausea. There is something physically sickening about seeing yourself removed in clean typography. I called Teresa. They are going to say it publicly. I told her. Then we make sure truth arrives before applause hardens the lie. I don't want Grace in the middle. She is already in the middle, Ellie. The question is whether she stands in fog or in fact. Teresa contacted the Veterans Council president, a retired Navy captain named Howard Leland. I had met him twice. He was cordial, formal, and fond of procedure, which in that moment became a blessing. He called me the next morning. Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker, he said, and I nearly cried at the simple accuracy of it. Colonel Bell has raised concerns about the program for Tuesday. May I come by and review documentation? Yes, I said. Please. He arrived in a pressed shirt, with a small notebook and the wary expression of a man who suspected family drama but respected paperwork. Joe Alvarez came over too, invited by me, sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and a mug of coffee between his hands. I laid out the binder. Howard Leland read everything carefully. He did not rush. He checked names, dates, ranks, certificates, award citations, and the photograph of me standing beside a litter on a dusty flight line in 1991. I was younger in that picture, face thinner, hair tucked beneath a cap, one hand on a patient's shoulder. Behind me, the aircraft ramp yawned open. Howard paused at the air medal citation. This is the original? Yes. Certified copy is pending, but that is the original certificate and citation. He read in silence. Joe watched him. At last, Howard closed the binder gently. Ma'am, I owe you an apology on behalf of the council. We should have verified the language before allowing it near our event. Have you printed the programs? He hesitated. Yes, there it was. The lie had become ink. Can they be corrected? The banquet is in 6 days. We can print an insert. I can also adjust the remarks. Joe leaned forward. Can you stop Mark from speaking? Howard's mouth tightened. The foundation arranged part of the program. Removing him may create a scene. I laughed softly. Captain Leland, I believe the scene has already been scheduled. He looked at me then, not as a widow or a donor's mother, but as someone who understood command decisions. What would you like? I looked at the binder. Then at Samuel's empty chair. I want accuracy. I want no ambush. And if they accuse me publicly, I want the correction made publicly. Not in a hallway afterward, not in a private apology. In the room where the lie is spoken. Howard nodded once. Understood. Before he left, he asked whether I knew a Daniel Price. The name moved through me like a hand touching an old bruise. Yes. I knew him when he was Sergeant Price. Why? He contacted the council last month asking about attending. Said he saw Samuel's scholarship announcement and recognized your name, but he wasn't sure it was the same family. I believe Colonel Bell has since spoken with him. He is on the guest list. I sat back. Daniel Price was alive, retired, and coming to the banquet. For 35 years, I had carried his letter in a binder. I had not known he lived 2 counties away. That night, he called me. His voice was older, rougher, but I recognized the rhythm of it before I recognized the man. Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker? This is Dan Price. I hope I'm not intruding. I stood in my kitchen with one hand on the counter. Daniel, I said, you are not intruding. He was quiet. Then he gave a small laugh that broke halfway through. Ma'am, I have been trying to decide what to say for 35 years. You already said plenty. I still have your letter. My wife keeps copies. She says I wrote more to you than I did to her that year. We both laughed gently, the kind of laughter that respects old pain. He told me he had retired from the civil service, had 3 children, 6 grandchildren, 1 bad knee, and a wife named Carol who never let him forget that he had promised her a trip to the Grand Canyon. I told him about Samuel, about Grace, about the scholarship, and finally about Mark's accusations. The line went silent. When Daniel spoke again, the soldier was back in his voice. Ma'am, with respect, no one gets to call the person who kept me alive a liar while I'm in the room. I closed my eyes. I don't want a spectacle. Neither do I. I want the record. That was the difference between revenge and truth. Revenge wants suffering. Truth wants the record. The days before the banquet carried a strange calm. Mark did not call. Denise sent a group text about arrival times, dress code, and donor photos. She addressed it to family and volunteers. My name appeared near the bottom, under general seating. I replied with one word. Received. Grace called the night before. Grandma, are you coming tomorrow? Yes, sweetheart. Dad said you might not feel up to it. I feel up to honoring your grandfather. She hesitated. And you? Children hear more than adults intend. They may not understand the shape of a conflict, but they feel where the floor is cracking. I am coming as myself. I said, can I sit with you? My heart twisted. Ask your parents first. Mom says I have to sit up front for pictures. Then sit where they ask. I will see you from wherever I am. Grandma? Yes. Were you brave? I looked across the room at my blue binder on the table. Sometimes, I said, and sometimes I was scared and did my job anyway. She seemed satisfied with that. That's what brave means, I think. After we hung up, I chose what to wear. Not the jacket, not the medals. That was important. I would not arrive looking like a challenge. I wore a dark navy suit, pearls Samuel had given me on our 30th anniversary, and a small Air Force lapel pin. I placed the blue binder in a leather tote and slid Daniel's old letter into the front pocket. I also placed inside a sealed envelope Samuel had left in the cedar box years earlier. I had almost forgotten about that envelope until Teresa asked whether Samuel had ever written anything about my service. Samuel had. Of course he had. He had written letters the way some men check fences, steadily and without ceremony. The envelope was addressed to Grace when she is old enough to ask who we were. He had written it during his final illness, when she was 6. I had not opened it because it was hers. The night before the banquet, with my hands trembling, I opened it carefully, over steam from a kettle so the flap would loosen without tearing. I told myself I was doing it to protect Samuel's intent. I still felt like I was trespassing. The letter was 2 pages, written in his square, uneven hand. He told Grace he had loved being a soldier. He told her service was not one shape. Then he wrote, your grandmother flew into places where sane people were trying to leave. I wore stripes on my sleeve. She wore an oak leaf on her shoulder. I was proud when men called me sergeant. I was prouder when they called her ma'am. I cried then. Not loudly, just enough to wet the edge of the page. At the bottom, Samuel had added, if anyone ever tries to make my service bigger by making hers smaller, don't believe them. That is not honor. That is theft. I folded the letter along its original crease and put it in the envelope. He would have hated the public ugliness. He would have hated Mark's pain. But he would have hated the lie more. The banquet hall smelled of floor wax, coffee, and brisket when I arrived. American flags lined the walls. Round tables filled the room, each with a small centerpiece made of red carnations, white carnations, and a tiny blue star. At the front stood a podium with the foundation logo, Samuel's enlarged portrait, and a framed photograph of his boots from some old field exercise. His empty chair sat beside the family table with the same blue name card from the first year. My name card was not there. A volunteer checked the seating chart and smiled apologetically. Mrs. Whitaker, you're at table 19. Right back there by the kitchen. I looked toward the front. Mark was adjusting the microphone. Denise was speaking to a reporter. Grace sat beside Samuel's empty chair, swinging her feet beneath the table. When she saw me, she lifted one hand in a small wave. I waved back. Table 19 was not an accident. It was close enough for people to say I had been included, and far enough for cameras to ignore me. I sat down, placed my cane against the chair, and set the blue binder on my lap. Joe Alvarez arrived 5 minutes later and sat beside me without asking. Thought you might need someone rude enough not to pretend this is normal, he said. Joe, you are a comfort to difficult women everywhere. He grinned. My late wife said the same thing with less affection. Teresa Bell arrived next, wearing a charcoal suit and a small ribbon pin. Howard Leland met her near the door. They spoke quietly. Then Daniel Price entered with his wife Carol. I had prepared myself to see a young wounded sergeant aged into an old man. I had not prepared myself for the look in his eyes when he found me. He crossed the room slowly, leaning on a cane of his own. His hair was silver, his shoulders rounded, but when he stopped in front of me, he straightened as much as his body allowed. Ma'am, he said. I stood. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I took both his hands. Danielle. His wife wiped her eyes before anyone had said another word. I brought something, he said. From his inside jacket pocket, he removed an old photograph protected in a plastic sleeve. It showed a hospital room in Germany, 1991. Daniel in bed, pale and thin, with bandages across his chest. I stood beside him in desert camouflage, one hand on the rail. Samuel was on the other side, visiting during transport coordination, grinning at the camera as if he had personally argued death out of the room. On the back, in Samuel's handwriting, were the words, "Ellie brought this man home." I had never seen that photograph. Sam mailed it to me, Daniel said. Said if I ever forgot who to thank, the picture would remind me. My breath caught. Joe muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," which was as close to prayer as he got at banquets. I slid the photograph into the binder. It felt as if Samuel had arrived by mail 35 years late and exactly on time. Dinner began. Pastor Mercer gave an invocation. He glanced toward my table when he said the word truth. I could not tell whether it was courage or guilt. Mark welcomed everyone. He looked handsome in a dark suit, Samuel's old tie clip at his collar. He had my son's face, older now, heavier with responsibility and pride. I remembered teaching that face to blow on hot soup. I remembered wiping tears from it after a Little League strikeout. That is the cruelty of family betrayal. The person hurting you is never only the person hurting you. He is also every age you loved him. Denise spoke after Mark. She thanked donors, volunteers, the Veterans Council, and the Whitaker family for protecting Samuel's legacy. Her eyes moved over the room without landing on me. The first scholarship recipient was a young woman named Marisol Vega, whose father had served in the Marine Corps and whose mother worked nights as a nurse. Marisol planned to study aviation maintenance. When she accepted her certificate, she looked nervous and proud. I thought Samuel would have liked her. For a few minutes, I let myself enjoy that part. The scholarship was still doing good despite the hands trying to steer it. That is one of life's hardest complications. Wrong motives can sometimes carry good things, and good things can be used to hide wrong motives. Then Mark returned to the microphone for what the printed program called legacy remarks. I felt Joe shift beside me. Teresa's eyes sharpened. Howard Leland stood near the side wall, one hand on the back of a chair. Daniel Price sat 2 tables behind Mark, his old photograph now in my binder, his jaw set. Mark began with Samuel. He told the familiar stories, the muddy boots, the engine repair under bad conditions, the way Samuel sent home funny postcards from miserable places. People smiled. I smiled too, because those stories were true. Then Mark's tone changed. As this foundation grows, he said, we have had to make hard decisions about protecting the integrity of my father's legacy. The room quieted. He picked up my jacket from a chair behind the podium. I had not known he had it. Later, I learned Denise had taken it from the garment bag months earlier during the garage leak visit and kept it in a storage box at their house. At that moment, all I knew was the shock of seeing my name held in my son's hands like an exhibit for the prosecution. Some of you may have heard confusion about military honors in our family, he said. I want to address that gently and respectfully. Gently, respectfully. Those words entered the room wearing gloves. He turned the jacket toward the audience. My mother has been struggling since my father's passing and since her health episode last year. She has begun identifying certain military items as hers. We love her. We are trying to protect her dignity. But tonight is about real sacrifice. A woman at the next table inhaled sharply. Howard Leland frowned but did not move. Pastor Mercer looked down. Mark continued. My father was the veteran whose legacy built this foundation. My mother supported him, and that matters. But she was not the officer these items suggest. She did not earn these medals. She was a nurse near military settings, and grief has blurred some memories. Then came the line that opened this story. For the dignity of real veterans, he said, we need to be honest. He had the microphone. I had the record. Still, I did not stand. Not because it did not hurt. It hurt so much my fingers went numb around the binder. But I had spent enough years in uniform to know that timing is part of command. When a false report is being given, you let the speaker establish exactly what is false before you correct the record. Mark set the jacket over the podium rail. The silver oak leaf caught the overhead light. He had no idea it was shining against him. I ask everyone, he said, to help us honor my father's authentic service and protect this foundation from confusion. He looked toward my table then, publicly tender, privately triumphant. Mom, we love you. Please don't make this harder. The room turned. Not fully, just enough. 100 faces tried to look at me without appearing to stare. Grace was crying silently at the front table. That moved me more than anything Mark had said. Until that moment, part of me had still wanted to spare him. But when I saw my granddaughter wipe her cheeks with the back of her hand, I understood that sparing a liar can mean abandoning a child to the lie. I opened the binder. Howard Leland stepped forward before I could stand. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, voice carrying without the microphone, "please pause." Mark blinked. "Captain Leland, I was just finishing." "You are finished for the moment." A different silence entered the hall. Authority has its own temperature. Howard walked to the podium. Mark did not surrender the microphone immediately. It was only a second, but everyone saw it. Then Howard took it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "a factual correction is required." Denise rose halfway from her chair. "Howard, this is a family matter." Teresa Bell's voice cut from the side aisle. "No, Mrs. Whitaker, your family made it a public accusation in a veterans hall. The correction will be public as well." Somebody whispered, "Who is that?" Teresa walked forward with a folder in her hand. I stood then, slowly. My knee protested. Joe steadied my chair but did not touch my arm. He knew better. I lifted the blue binder from the table. The walk from table 19 to the front of the hall was not long, but it contained 40 years. I passed people who had eaten at my house, prayed beside me, complimented my pies, asked me to watch grandchildren, and accepted Mark's concern without checking whether concern was telling the truth. Some lowered their eyes. A few looked directly at me with apology already forming. Grace stood up at the family table. "Grandma," she whispered. I paused beside her and touched her shoulder. "Stay right there, sweetheart. Listen carefully." When I reached the podium, Mark's face had gone pale under the stage lights. "Mom," he said softly, away from the microphone. "Don't." It was the same word a child uses when a parent reaches for the light switch after discovering a broken lamp. I looked at him. "You did this here. It will be answered here." Howard adjusted the microphone down for me. I placed the blue binder on the podium. My hands were steady now. "My name is Eleanor Ruth Whitaker," I said. "I served in the United States Air Force Nurse Corps for 26 years and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 2006. The jacket my son is holding is mine. The name tape is mine. The silver oak leaf on that shoulder is the rank I earned. The medals he called confusion are documented in my official record." No one moved. I opened the binder to the certified service record Calvin had helped me obtain. The raised seal caught the light. "Captain Leland has reviewed these documents. So has Colonel Teresa Bell, my former commanding officer." Teresa stepped beside me. "I am retired Colonel Teresa Bell, United States Air Force," she said. "I commanded Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker during her final assignment. I have reviewed her service record. It is authentic. Her rank is authentic. Her awards are authentic. The accusation made tonight is false." False. The word landed harder because Teresa did not decorate it. Mark stared at the binder as if paper had betrayed him. Denise moved toward him, but Howard raised one hand. "Please remain seated." Then Daniel Price stood. It took him effort. Carol reached for his cane, but he waved her off and used both hands on the table to rise. The hall watched this old man straighten under the flags. "Captain Leland," he said, "may I speak?" Howard looked at me. I nodded. Daniel walked forward slowly. Every step seemed to pull the room deeper into the truth. When he reached the front, he did not look at Mark first. He looked at me. "Ma'am," he said. "Permission?" I could barely answer. "Granted." He turned to the audience. "My name is retired Master Sergeant Daniel Price, United States Army. In February of 1991, I was wounded during operations in Saudi Arabia. I was evacuated by air through a chain of medical care I only half remember because I was bleeding, feverish, and scared out of my mind. I remember her." He pointed one trembling hand toward me. "Not because she gave a speech. Not because she wanted attention. Because when the aircraft shook and I thought I was dying, then Captain Whitaker put her hand on my chest and said, 'Sergeant, you are not dying on my aircraft. Your wife is expecting you home, and I do not like disappointing women.'" A broken laugh moved through the room, followed by several people wiping their eyes. Daniel reached into his jacket and removed the old photograph. Howard held it up while Teresa took the microphone back. "This photograph," Teresa said, "shows Captain Eleanor Whitaker with Sergeant Price during medical evacuation recovery in 1991. On the back is a note written by Master Sergeant Samuel Whitaker." She turned the photo over and read Samuel's words. "Ellie brought this man home." For the first time that evening, Mark looked at his father's portrait as if it had turned to face him. I thought that would be the strongest moment. It was not. Howard looked at me. "Lieutenant Colonel," Is there additional material you wish entered into the foundation record? That phrase mattered. Foundation record. Not gossip, not emotion, record. I removed Samuel's sealed letter. This was written by my husband for our granddaughter, I said. I did not intend to read it publicly, but my husband's name has been used tonight to erase part of the family truth. He has a right to answer that. Grace's eyes widened. I unfolded the pages. My voice nearly failed on the first sentence, but steadied by the second. I read only the part that mattered. Your grandmother flew into places where sane people were trying to leave. I wore stripes on my sleeve. She wore an oak leaf on her shoulder. I was proud when men called me sergeant. I was prouder when they called her ma'am. If anyone ever tries to make my service bigger by making hers smaller, don't believe them. That is not honor. That is theft. The hall went completely still. There are silences that hide. There are silences that judge. This one listened. Grace covered her mouth with both hands. Denise sat down as if her legs had stopped negotiating. Mark looked like a man watching a bridge collapse behind him. Howard returned to the microphone. On behalf of the San Antonio Veterans Council, he said, I correct the record. Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Whitaker is a verified veteran of the United States Air Force. Her service and awards are documented. The earlier statement questioning her service was incorrect and should not have been made. Then he turned to me and, in front of the room, saluted. I had not been saluted in years. Not formally, not like that. My first instinct was to step back. My second was to receive what was being given. I returned the salute as best I could with an old shoulder and a full heart. The room rose slowly. Not all at once, not theatrically. Chairs scraped. Veterans stood first, then spouses, then donors, then church friends. Joe Alvarez stood beside table 19 with tears running into his mustache and not a hint of embarrassment. Applause came, but I remember it less than I remember Grace leaving the family table. She walked past her father, past Denise, and came to me. She did not ask permission. She wrapped both arms around my waist and pressed her face against my suit. I'm sorry, Grandma, she whispered. I bent down as much as my knee allowed. You have nothing to be sorry for. I believed him a little. That honesty broke me open in a place anger could not reach. Then you listened when truth came. I said, that matters more. Mark stepped forward, face wet now, but Howard put a hand between us. Not yet, Howard said quietly. That small protection meant more than a speech. It acknowledged something my family had forgotten. I did not owe immediate access to the person who had publicly harmed me. Denise began to speak. Ellie, we didn't understand. Teresa turned to her. You understood enough to print it. Denise closed her mouth. The banquet could have ended there, but consequences rarely arrive in one neat package. Once a lie collapses, people begin noticing the scaffolding. Howard asked for the printed programs to be collected from each table. Volunteers moved through the hall, removing the pages that described Samuel's legacy of authentic service in a way that erased mine. At first, it felt awkward, almost excessive. Then I realized public correction must sometimes be visible to undo visible harm. Pastor Mercer came to the microphone without being asked. His hands trembled around a folded program. I owe Mrs. Whitaker an apology, he said. Then he stopped and looked at me. No, Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker. I repeated concern without verifying truth. I allowed language that implied confusion where there was documented service. I valued keeping peace over protecting a member of my congregation from falsehood. I am sorry. It was specific. That mattered. I nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Recognition. Marisol Vega, the scholarship recipient, stood near the stage, clutching her certificate. She looked uncertain, as if the honor she had received had been stained by adult conflict. I did not want that. I walked toward her. Marisol, I said into the microphone, this scholarship still belongs to your future. Do not let our family failure make you feel less proud tonight. Samuel would have been honored by your work. So am I. She began to cry then, and I hugged her. The room applauded again, softer this time. That moment saved the evening from becoming only an exposure. It reminded all of us that truth is not meant to burn everything down. It is meant to make a safe place for what is worth keeping. Mark did not speak again that night. When the banquet ended, people approached me in careful waves. Some offered thanks. Some offered apologies. Some told stories of mothers, sisters, wives, and grandmothers whose service had been minimized because it did not fit someone's picture of war. A retired Navy nurse took my hand and said, they called me support too, until their sons needed me. We looked at each other and understood more than words could carry. Daniel Price waited until the crowd thinned. "Ma'am," he said, "I should have found you sooner." "You were busy living," I said. "That was the point." At the back of the hall, Mark stood alone, holding the service jacket he had raised against me. He looked smaller than he had on stage, not because truth had humiliated him, but because it had removed the false height he had built for himself. Grace walked over to him, and I heard only one sentence. "Dad," she said, "you said Grandpa would be ashamed." Mark flinched, as if the metal citations had struck him harder than any hand could. I did not go to him. Joe drove me home in his old pickup because my legs were tired and my heart felt too full for traffic. The blue binder sat between us on the bench seat like a passenger. At home, I hung my jacket back in the hallway closet. I touched the silver oak leaf once before closing the door. Then I sat in Samuel's chair. I had avoided that chair for 3 years. It felt like trespassing on grief. But that night, with the binder on my lap, I understood something. The chair had not been empty only because Samuel was gone. It had been empty because I kept waiting for him to stand up for me. I loved my husband. I still do. But the living must not outsource their dignity to the dead. The consequences came quietly at first. Howard Leland issued a formal correction on behalf of the Veterans Council. The printed programs were withdrawn. The foundation board called an emergency meeting. I attended with Rachel Kim, Colonel Bell, and the blue binder that Mark had once mocked. Across the table, Mark looked exhausted. Denise looked polished, until Rachel placed the bank statements beside the program proofs. There had been reimbursements to Mark's struggling business. Some were legitimate, some were not. There had also been emails discussing how to make donors understand that I was becoming unreliable. Denise called it messaging. Rachel called it evidence. Mark did not fight long. The business was failing, he said. I thought if people trusted me instead of Mom, no one would ask questions. I looked at him and saw the boy who had once dragged my flight jacket down the hallway. Love did not disappear. It simply stood beside accountability and refused to leave. "You try to make me smaller," I said, "so no one would notice how much room you were taking." The board removed Mark as president and Denise as communications director. The accounts were frozen until restitution was made. The scholarship was not destroyed because I did not want Samuel's name or Marisol's future buried under Mark's failure. But the foundation was rebuilt under new rules, with outside oversight, accurate records, and no family authority that depended on trust alone. Grace did not come to my house for 2 weeks. That was the hardest consequence. I sent her a card with a tiny airplane on the envelope and wrote, "I love you every day, including quiet days. Grandma." On the 3rd Saturday, Mark brought her over. He stood on the porch, eyes red, hands empty. "Can we talk?" he asked. We sat outside. Not inside. The house was mine, and the porch was as far as trust could reach that day. "Start by naming it," I said. He swallowed. "I lied about your service. I let people think you were confused. I took your jacket without permission. I used Dad's name to make people believe me. I let Grace believe something false about you. I used the foundation to cover money problems." It hurt to hear. It mattered that he said it. "Why?" "Because Dad was easier to understand," he whispered. "Because people knew how to honor him. Because I was ashamed that I never understood you. And then I turned that shame into proof against you." I let the words sit between us. "Your pain did not give you the right to lie about my life," I said. "It did not give you the right to touch my records. It did not give you the right to teach my granddaughter that honor belongs only to the loudest story." Tears slipped down his face. "I know. Here is what happens next. You will repay what you owe. You will cooperate with the board. You will issue a written public correction approved by Rachel and the council. You will tell Grace the truth without making yourself the victim. You will not enter my house without invitation. You will not discuss my health, finances, memory, or service with anyone without my permission. And if you want any hope of rebuilding trust with me, you will begin counseling." He nodded. "Okay." "Forgiveness may come," I said. "Trust will not be assumed." Grace returned from the yard with lemonade and a careful look on her face. "Are you fighting?" Mark wiped his cheek. "No, honey. Grandma is telling me the truth, and I'm listening." Grace handed him a cup. "Good, 'cause you need to listen better." That was the first small repair. More came slowly. Mark repaid the foundation. Denise sent a letter on plain paper, not company stationery. She wrote, "I treated your life like a branding problem. I used the word dignity when I meant control. I am sorry for stealing your jacket, changing the program, and letting Grace believe disrespect could be called protection." I did not answer for 3 weeks. When I did, I wrote, "I accept that you understand the harm. Repair will require behavior over time. The scholarship was renamed the Samuel and Eleanor Whitaker Service Scholarship. At first, I resisted. Old habits speak quickly. Then Teresa sat across from me at my kitchen table and said, "Ellie, your name is not an insult to his." She was right. The new scholarship honored veterans, military spouses, medical personnel, caregivers, and students entering skilled trades connected to service communities. Marisol Vega received a renewed award the following semester. Daniel Price and his wife attended the small board meeting where the change became official. Grace sat beside me and practiced saying Lieutenant Colonel until she could say it without stumbling. "It's a lot of syllables," she complained. "So was hippopotamus once," I said. She grinned. "Lieutenant Colonel Grandma. That is not my official title." "It is now." I let her have it. The following Veterans Day, I arrived early at the same hall. The room was quiet except for volunteers unfolding, chairs, and the distant clatter of coffee urns. Sunlight touched the podium where my son had once tried to erase me. The microphone stood waiting. I walked past it without fear. At the front table, my place card was already set properly. Eleanor Whitaker, Lieutenant Colonel, USAF, retired. Not near the kitchen, not in the family section as an afterthought. At the table, in the record, where I belonged. Grace had drawn a small blue star beside my name. Mark came in carrying a tray of coffee cups. He paused at the doorway and waited until I nodded before crossing the room. That question, asked without words, mattered more than any speech he had given. "Black, 2 sugars," he said, setting a cup in front of me. "You remembered." I'm trying to remember things correctly. There was a time when I would have answered with a wound. That day, I answered with the truth. That is a good start. When the ceremony began, Grace walked to the microphone with a sheet of notebook paper in both hands. "My grandpa Samuel fixed engines and helped soldiers," she read. "My grandma Eleanor was an Air Force nurse and officer. She helped bring wounded people home. My grandpa wrote that making one person's service bigger by making another person's smaller is not honor. It is theft. I think families have to remember the whole truth." Her voice shook, but she did not stop. I looked at Mark. He was crying quietly, not asking anyone to comfort him. That, too, was a kind of progress. Later, at home, I opened the blue binder and added 3 new pages. Mark's public correction, Denise's apology, Grace's speech. I placed them behind a tab labeled Repair. That tab had not existed before. Grace made it with a label maker because she believed every important thing should have a proper place. The binder changed after that. It was no longer only a shield. It held service records, yes, but also Samuel's letter, Daniel's photograph, the corrected scholarship program, and the first evidence that my family was learning to tell the truth without being forced. That evening, I opened the hallway closet. Samuel's uniform hung on one side, my service jacket hung on the other. For years, I had thought of that closet as storage, then as evidence. Now it felt like a witness that had finally been allowed to speak. I ran my fingers over Samuel's stripes, then over my silver oak leaf. The fabric was only fabric. The metal was only metal. The records were only paper. None of it made us honorable by itself. Honor lived in what we did, who we protected, what we admitted, and how we repaired what we had broken. But objects matter because people forget. A jacket can say, "I was here." A binder can say, "This happened." A letter can say, "The dead did not give you permission to lie." I closed the closet door, not to hide the truth, but because it no longer needed guarding every minute. For a long time, I had believed the greatest victory would be hearing the room applaud after the truth came out. I was wrong. Applause fades quickly. The greater victory was quieter. It was my granddaughter knowing the whole story. It was my son learning that regret does not outrank repair. It was my own hand opening the binder without trembling. It was Samuel's memory standing beside mine instead of being used against it. Respect should not have required witnesses. My family should not have needed a binder, a photograph, a council president, a colonel, and a wounded soldier to believe what had been hanging in the hallway closet for decades. But once the truth had witnesses, no one could make me small again. The jacket did not change who I was. The record did not make me worthy. The ceremony did not give me honor. It only made it impossible for them to keep pretending they had never seen me.